morning and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Part of our mission is to disseminate regionally relevant information to our stakeholders in Oregon and Washington. So we try to do this by offering a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars is just one way we accomplish that. To learn more about the consortium or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. And I went ahead and put that in the chat window for you. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel. And you can find both those links on our website, which I've, again, put that link in the chat box. So today I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Case. Michael is a research scientist and has more than 15 years of experience assessing the climate change vulnerability of species and ecosystems. Applying this information, he works with federal, state, tribal, and nonprofit organizations to implement adaptation strategies. So Michael, whenever you're ready, go for it.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, thanks for joining our webinar. Today I'll be presenting some of the results and a case study from a project that links a vegetation model with tribally important ecosystem services, and then projects those changes into the future. This webinar will probably take about 20, maybe 25 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So I am one of 3 people that worked on this project. John Kim and Becky Kearns, both with the Forest Service, helped from the beginning. And to give you a little context, John, Becky, and I helped facilitate an adaptation planning workshop in Oregon last year for the Forest Service. And it was at this workshop where we were approached by a number of resource managers from the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and they wanted more detailed projections, climate projections and vegetation projections for their reservation and the lands that they use for resource gathering and spiritual needs. They also wanted to know how climate change might impact the goods and services that they rely on. So that was kind of the impetus of this project. So our objective was to apply MC2, which is a dynamic general vegetation model, and assess changes to vegetation, fire, and these ecosystem services. Now, DGVMs, or dynamic general vegetation models, are process-based models that use climate, so things like temperature and precipitation, carbon dioxide concentrations, and soils data to simulate dominant vegetation in these really broad plant functional type groups. MC2 then combines those plant functional types with other mechanistic processes such as growth and competition, establishment, mortality, and even disturbances such as fire. And one of the outputs that MC2 generates are vegetation types, and these are still pretty broad, but they can cover, well, in this case, the Pacific Northwest. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. Our approach for the overall project was to first generate some maps of these key climate impacts, their uncertainties, and the underlying mechanisms driving some of those changes. And then we consulted with tribes to identify how those impacts translate to effects on tribal and tribally important ecosystem services. And I'll unpack that in a little bit. And then thirdly, to produce a vegetation type guide that summarizes those impacts, provide the data, and some examples on how to apply this information, and ultimately, identify some of these adaptation opportunities. Okay, so some of the nitty-gritty of the actual methodology here, the climate data that we used is from NASA, and it was downscaled to 1 kilometer resolution. And that means that our output from MC2 is also downscaled to about 1 kilometer resolution, okay? We simulated one future emission scenario, the RCP 8.5, which essentially is a business as usual scenario. And we used a number of different general circulation models. And we chose these because we wanted a range of possibilities. So we have our mean climate model, which is kind of right in the middle of the pack, so to speak. We have a hot dry, a hot wet, and what we call a cool, but it still projects warming. It's just less warming than some of the other ones. Okay, so this is a map of those vegetation types that MC2 simulates. This is for historical, and you'll notice that it doesn't include anthropogenic land uses, right? So, for example, in the Columbia Plateau and the Willamette, it projects there's actually, lots of vegetation there, which we know that those are heavily manipulated and controlled by human uses right now. So keeping that in mind, MC2 is able to simulate these kind of broad vegetation types. And I put the URL on this slide because I don't want to forget to, identify that this data is publicly available. So we'll talk about that in a little bit and how to download it, but I didn't want to forget that point. So using the MC2 data, I also assess changes in potential evapotranspiration, these vegetation types that you're looking at here, biomes, net primary productivity, live vegetation carbon stocks, and fire frequency and intensity. And MC2 provides a unique opportunity to assess some of these trends because it really is able to capture some of those interactions between climate and vegetation, disturbance, and carbon balance. So my objective, again, was to summarize these general trends and highlight some of the important impacts for planning purposes. So this is a map of one future climate scenario. This is that mean GCM, and this is for the end of the century. And I'm showing this because I want to illustrate how different some of these vegetation types change by the end of the century. So I'm just going to toggle back and forth between the historical and that end of century map. And you'll see some pretty big changes there. I should note that the black polygons on that map represent reservations, tribal reservations. But nevertheless, you definitely notice some pretty big changes. We have some vegetation types that are well adapted to warmer climates. So they're coming up from California. And I'm speaking specifically about that hot pink color on the map, that subtropical mixed forest type. And it's, essentially replacing a lot of the coniferous forests and moist coniferous forests in particular. And we also see quite a bit more of the warm mixed forests kind of encroaching on some of those areas. And of course, on the interior, on the east side of the Cascades, there's a lot of transitions between the woodland, forest, and shrubland types here. So what I did, this graph here illustrates some of those changes by vegetation type, okay? So vegetation types are on the bottom of this graph, and the percents on the y-axis represent percents of total area that they cover on the landscape, okay? So the black diamond on this graph represents historical. And then you see the range of GCM or climate possibilities for the future. So this helps illustrate how those different GCMs project differences in how much landscape those types cover. So for example, take the first one, subalpine forest. Historically, we have about 6 or 7% of the landscape covered by subalpine forests. That's today. In the future, all the GCMs pretty much agree that we're going to lose that subalpine forest. So it goes down to about 0 in some cases. And those percent at the bottom, those are the percent change overall. So I just average across those GCMs. Now the next one over the subtropical mixed forest, you see there is very little historically on the landscape, but in the future we could see some pretty big changes, and 8.5 or 8.7% increase overall. But again, those GCMs differ quite a bit depending on what scenario you're looking at. So another output that MC2 simulates is biomes, and this is even more coarse or broad than those vegetation types. But I think it's also useful for planning purposes, particularly when looking to see where those transitions between forest and woodland and shrubland may occur in the future. So this is a historical map of biomes. So all the forests were lumped together, all the woodlands lumped, all the shrublands lumped, so on and so forth. And then if we look at, again, that mean model for the future, by the end of the century, there's some pretty big changes. I'm toggling back and forth between historical and that future. And we see that overall forests are expanding. And this is illustrated by this graph similar to the vegetation types here. We see an increase overall of about 6%. And that means that woodlands and shrublands are losing out. And so they both have a decrease in the amount of area that they're able to cover or simulated to cover in the future. Another, I think, useful way of looking at this information is to look at the change in biome extent. So these are two maps, predicted forest gain on the left and predicted forest loss on the right-hand side. The intensity of the colors, the blue on the left and the brown or yellow on the right, represents agreement among many more climate models. Okay, so for this example, we use 28 different climate models. But nevertheless, it gives you a sense of where on the landscape some of those changes are projected to occur. And, not surprisingly, a lot of them are at those ecotones, or those transitions between forest and woodland, forest and shrubland types. So I think that could be particularly helpful when planning for, restoration, or if there's going to be intensive forestry management, things like that. But for this project, we're more interested in ecosystem services. Specifically, we wanted to assess the impacts to ecosystem services, but many of these services aren't spatially mapped, okay? So we had to link them together with the vegetation types. But first, we identified some tribally important ecosystem services and species. We identified about 81 different ones, and they included things like first foods, medicinal plants, timber production, culturally significant trees, arid land, root plants, animal species. And these are, species used for both hunting and cultural significance, grazing quality, agricultural suitability, things like that. And then we determined their corresponding vegetation type using a combination of literature reviews, expert elicitation, and then we assessed the change based on those suitable habitat types. Okay, so this is a graph that illustrates the change, the overall change in those vegetation types that each of the ecosystem services corresponds with. So, for example, huckleberries tend to be found in cool, moist forest habitat types. Okay, so if we look at changes in cool, moist forest types, that will give us some indication of how, for example, huckleberries might be affected in the future. Overall, we found that 41 of these ecosystem services and species, mostly mammals and birds, are projected to lose habitat in the future, whereas about 19, mostly trees and plants, were projected to gain habitat, and then maybe another 19 or so didn't have much change overall. I should note that this is just for one, the mean climate model. So if we wanted to look at different climate models, we would get somewhat different projections here. So overall, we found that first foods and medicinal plants were projected to increase in suitable habitat. with the exception of huckleberries and grass species. Timber production and culturally significant trees were also projected to increase in suitable habitat, with the exception of Pacific silver fir, namely because it likes higher elevation, moist habitats. Arid land plants are projected to decline in suitable habitat. Animals are projected to either decline or overall not experience much change. Birds are projected to decline. Grazing quality and agricultural suitability are both projected to decline. Okay, so what do we do with this information? How can this be useful for planning purposes? And to address that, or to answer that, I want to give a quick case study on huckleberries. There's been a lot of interest recently on these species, vaccinium species, and they're very relevant for tribes. So historically, many of these species of huckleberries tend to be found in these kind of cool, moist forest vegetation types. So if we lump all those cool, moist forest types together, things like subalpine meadows and woodlands and forests, moist coniferous forests, and even some coniferous forests, we get a map of these green areas. So these essentially represent suitable habitat for all huckleberry species. It's pretty coarse, but it gives you a sense of where they might be on the landscape. We look at one simulation for the future. This is by mid-century. Okay, so the green areas are still suitable. Those blue areas represent potential expansion. So that means that they're not currently found in those areas right now, meaning that the habitat isn't suitable for them currently, but it might be in the future. And then those brown areas, those are areas of potential contraction. So they're currently suitable habitat there right now, but in the future, it might not be so suitable, okay? So overall, cool, moist forest types are projected to decline in the future by mid-century. And this is even more pronounced by the end of the century. So we obviously see a lot more brown areas suggesting some contraction in suitable habitat for that species. There is some areas of blue, though, and each of these categories offers different opportunities for us. So knowing which areas of pseudohabitat I think are projected to change could inform these management actions and restoration of this important first food. So for instance, the areas that are projected to remain suitable, again, those green areas, these might be areas that are more actively managed for habitat resilience and protection. Okay, so there's going to be less green areas in the future, we think. So tighter control on harvesting in some of these green areas might be warranted, maybe limits on recreation, or just overall habitat protection. And I show the sign here of, trampling kills meadows, so please stay on the trail. So that might be an example of some of the strategies that we employ or consider for some of these green areas. Now, areas that are projected to contract, those brown areas, might be areas where we implement monitoring. And this would be to not only assess what the driving mechanisms are causing that change, if huckleberry habitat is becoming less suitable in these brown areas, what's driving that? And also, I think it's important to keep an eye on these habitats because some might turn out to be resilient to those changes. And so teasing those mechanisms out could really inform future management as well. So monitoring in some of those brown areas. And then lastly, areas that were projected to expand, those blue areas, might be areas that are new suitable habitat where huckleberries could be planted. And that could also include experimental plantings. Considering the genetics of the species or different species. There's many different types of vaccinium huckleberries. But these might be opportunities to really promote new huckleberry habitat. So each of those strategies can be implemented depending on that habitat and where it's going to be suitable and where it won't be. But I want to stress that these are obviously not new concepts for conservation, right? So people have been actively burning prime huckleberry habitat for thousands of years to open it up and to reduce encroachment. However, now we have some additional tools that will help us enable, focus our efforts in light of some of the future changes. So it's not just responding to what's happened in the past, but anticipating what might happen in the future. And so these pictures, this is a cool project that the Tulalip tribes are doing in association with the Forest Service at Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And historically, the Tulalip tribes have used this area as prime huckleberry habitat. But over the last few decades, tree encroachment has really deteriorated the huckleberry production. And so now they're teaming up with the Forest Service and getting people out on the ground to help clear some of the conifer saplings that are encroaching in some of these meadows and ensure huckleberry persists. And in the picture, you see the upper left corner, a big tarp. Those are a bunch of conifer saplings, subalpine fir, that they're dragging out of the meadow. And in the lower right corner, you see some Tulalip tribes, some teens from the tribes helping do that clearing and remove the conifer. And I'll just note that they have noticed that there's been an increase in the huckleberry production in this particular area. So it's working. Okay, so huckleberries are just one of those 81 ecosystem services or goods that we considered. So there's 80 other examples that we could unpack here, but it gives you a sense of how this information hopefully will be used. And I should note that there are a number of tribes, some of the project partners that are attempting to incorporate this information not only into their vulnerability assessments, but also into some of the grant writing that they're creating for future adaptation work, so the implementation part of that. So if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to go into more details about that. I wanted to note that website that I mentioned earlier. This is tribes.forestry.oregonstate.edu. And on that website, we have a link for the downloads, so you can download all the MC2 data. And we also have a number of links to presentations that I've given about the project and some helpful planning documents that we've used in another workshop. Okay, so with that, I want to thank the Forest Service for funding the project and our project partners for helping not only guide the process, but also giving some important feedback throughout that. And with that, I'll just open it up to any questions that you guys have.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. That was really interesting. Like Michael said, let's take some questions. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box. And perhaps while we're waiting, I'll sneak in a question here. And I'm curious if when you chose, did you work with the tribes to choose those 81 ecosystem services and goods?
Yeah, that's a good question. The shorter answer is yes, I did, but it was a process. Because I'm covering such a vast geographic area, it was challenging to really kind of hone in on particular tribes. I did do that, but that process was really instigated by some of the workshops and conferences that I attended and some of these tribal either members or resource managers that work for the tribe attended. So it was kind of word of mouth, but we were able to, populate this 81 species and services by feedback from them. Now, with that said, there were a number of species that were sensitive and that they, didn't really want to see on that list, since this is publicly available information. So we, excluded those as well.
Okay, thanks. So don't be shy. Go ahead and type any question you might have to Michael. Now's your chance. You have him on the line, and he's happy to answer any of your questions. So I saw in your presentation that it seemed like the tribes were already, they're doing a lot, but in particular your example with the Huckleberries, they're already doing some adaptation work on that. The work you've done, do you know if the tribes are incorporating that information? Are they using that?
Yeah, well, they're beginning to. So this is, this project is wrapping up right now. So this information and some of these examples of how to use it is really just getting out there. But I have talked to a number of tribes, and they've expressed interest in this. So just last week there was a tribal climate summit at the Tulalip Resort Casino, and it was attended by a lot of different tribes throughout the region. So Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska, and they want to get a hold of the data. They want to look it over, and then, I think some of them will decide whether it's ultimately useful to where they are in the process. I've noticed that there is quite a continuum of where people are in their planning process for preparing for climate change. Some are just beginning to conduct vulnerability assessments to see how some of their species and infrastructure and water, things like that, might be impacted by climate change. Whereas others, have completed that step and are already moved on to implementing some of the adaptation strategies. So, there is definitely no set pace that everyone kind of travels at, but I think that some of this information could be useful depending on where you are in that process.
Right, that makes sense. So we did have a couple questions come in. One, are there opportunities to combine MC2 projections with current landscape scale restoration or land management efforts, for example, thinning and burning? These activities could potentially shape vegetation projections. Yeah, definitely.
I think that there's great potential there. I think that, one of the limitations, I guess, of MC2 is that, well, it's not really a limitation. It's a caveat, is that it is potential vegetation. So making it more realistic to what's actually on the ground, I think could be particularly useful to those planning purposes. And, there are projections for even future land use that could be essentially laid over, some of these projections of vegetation to see areas that might change more due to human land use. And yes, the fire part and, how humans have manipulated the landscape already could definitely be incorporated. I don't know of anyone actively working on that part. So that would be a new avenue to kind of chase.
Great, thank you, Michael. Another question. Thanks for a great presentation. Can you please share more about how you address sacred sites or landscape features? I realize that tribes are understandably reluctant to reveal specific locations. Did you use veg types or a proxy for this as well?
To be honest, I didn't really consider it. I sensed early on in the project with some of my consultations with tribes that this was very important to them not to release some of this information as to where some of these sacred places are. And so we chose early on to not really incorporate that part. Some of the species I've done the modeling for and looked at how their suitable habitat might change, and I've essentially handed that off directly to tribes, but not presented that information. So I guess that's one workaround. But when it came to sacred sites, they weren't comfortable, releasing that information, so we didn't integrate it into this project.
Okay, thank you. Another question on the same line of questioning: has there been any partnership data sharing between UW Climate Impact Group, who is working with the Colville Reservation on a climate change drivers and species vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, so incidentally, I've also helped the Climate Impacts Group, or SIG, do their reports or work on their primary drivers of climate change for the Colville. This data presented today was not integrated into their vulnerability assessment. However, it could be. It wasn't part of the original proposal or outline for how they were going to approach that. And the reason for that is because this data wasn't available. We weren't really, our timeline was such that it just wasn't there. Now it is, so it could be, kind of incorporated at this point, but that would be additional work. So I'm not sure if that's really feasible before they move on to their adaptation planning stage.
Great, okay. Another one is the vegetation data from land fire. What scale is appropriate for the study to be applied? Stand, watershed, reservation-wide?
Yeah, great question. So the first part of that, the vegetation types are simulated by MC2. So there's no land fire data that is used to run the model. With that said, there are a number of different ways to calibrate MC2, and we do use some of the potential vegetation types to essentially evaluate how well MC2 is doing, and if those vegetation types match up with other groups. The second part of that question, could you repeat that, please, Carrie?
Of course. What scale is appropriate for the study to be applied? Stand, watershed, or reservation-wide?
Yeah, sorry. Scale is huge, right? So this project obviously looked at all of Washington and Oregon and a slice of Idaho. And these vegetation types are pretty darn coarse. So I would argue that, it really shouldn't be used for anything at a stand level. That's too fine resolution, especially considering that our spatial scale is more or less 1 square kilometer. So definitely not the stand. I would argue that it's probably region, maybe reservation. There are some large reservations out there. I'm thinking of the Yakima and Colville and Warm Springs. So it could be used at that scale, but I wouldn't go much finer than that.
Okay, thank you for that. Michael, I'm curious if the MC2 can simulate land use change.
It cannot, I should say it currently does not. It's possible that could be integrated into the model by using another. It would be essentially a new algorithm, but in the current version, it does not include that.
Okay, thank you. Well, I haven't seen any other questions come in. I'll just pause for a moment and let those last minute thoughts get into the chat box. But I wanted to thank Michael for talking with us today. That was a really great talk, and I definitely learned a lot. So thank you, Michael.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I can, Carrie, I'll just show the website real quick.
Yeah,
so
please. Oh, great.
Know where to go for the downloads if they're interested in that. So again, this is the website, tribes.forestry.oregonstate.edu. And for the MC2 data, if you want to download it, you just go over here to that downloads tab. And it's a little clunky. I apologize for that. I'm not a webmaster. But if you scroll down, the third one down here has the MC2 data. And you just click on that link, and there's a zip archive of it. It's not all that big. It's 600 megabytes. But when you unpack it, it grows in size. But that's how you get the MC2 data. So if you're interested, definitely encourage you to check that out. Play around with it. If you're comfortable, send me some questions if they come up. And yeah, I hope that this is a useful data source and tool for future planning purposes.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Well, thanks again. And I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in today. If you have an interesting idea for a webinar, please don't hesitate to get a hold of us. And just thanks again, Michael. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.